hockey fans, thank you so much for, as always, making us over at the Locked On NHL Network part of your first listen, your daily routine. We appreciate you so much. I couldn't say only Locked On Kraken because you might notice I have the fantastic host of Locked On Wild, Seth Toupal, joining us today. But Seth, we have some news, so we're going to get right into that coming up on Locked On Kraken meets Locked On Wild. All right, Seth, we're going to turn the mic over to you because we had this planned earlier in the day, and as things happen, and we didn't even get into what happened with us, but we got some hockey news. So I'm going to turn it over to you so you can let us know what's happening in the wild world of Minnesota hockey.
Well, first off, Erica, thanks for having me. I'm glad that we finally get a chance to do this because, as you mentioned, for me, I love what you're doing with Locked On Kraken, and just such great branding to be able to take for your intro. Pretty much every episode, and just start it with "What's Kraken." It's so good. So glad you went that route.
Yes.
So it's awesome.
Yeah, having fun with it.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, we got some news to start off here with tonight. It sounds like the Minnesota Wild have hit the COVID-19 wall here right before their matchup against the Seattle Kraken. I defer to Michael Russo, who has been all over the situation, as he so typically is for anything Minnesota Wild related. This came about 4 hours ago. Russo tweeting that he was getting the sense that the Wild were dealing with an expanded COVID-19 issue. He said Wild canceled practice 30 minutes before scheduled practice. While at the arena, they're supposed to practice in on a testing day here in Seattle. 3 assistant coaches who are not on the trip and general manager Bill Guerin all have COVID-19. He followed up quickly after that. To follow up on this, I hear the Wild are waiting for follow-up tests, but appears this has indeed filtered into the players. Thinks the Wild will need to recall a forward or 2. Piggybacking off of that, if these positives are confirmed, players likely will have to miss at least 10 days and stay in Seattle unless the Minnesota Wild can get them air ambulance back to Minnesota. And the final tweet in that bunch, hearing that the Minnesota Wild are expected to place at least 2 players in the COVID-19 protocol. Sources say Kyle Rao, Connor Dewar, and John Lizotte are being recalled from the Iowa Wilds of the AHL. And you look at those names, Rao and Dewar, both forwards, and then Lizotte is a defenseman. And so immediately to me, it looks as though it's guys from probably the 3rd or 4th line that are going to be on the COVID-19 protocol. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And then Lizotte being a defenseman, that would lead me to believe that it's one of those 3rd-line defensemen that is going to be put in the protocol as well. That, of course, is speculation. I have nothing to go off of in that regard, but it seems as though the Wild are going to be at least a couple of players short for the matchup coming up against the Kraken.
Wow. So first and foremost, I think we should definitely say that we are hoping the best for everyone impacted. This is still very much a thing, as we, with the Seattle Kraken, can attest to. We had some players that missed the opener due to this. So, of course, we want to make sure as much as possible that those that are impacted are not severely impacted, and hopefully that things get better for the Minnesota Wild on that front, Seth. But before we get into what we had planned, and we have some fans that reached out with some questions, one of the things that I was going to ask you about was special teams, because I was doing my routine and listening to Locked On Wild, and I know that was one of the things that you definitely circled. It's certainly been a pain point for the Seattle Kraken at times, but that it sounds like could, depending on what we ultimately see as the final roster for the Wild. I mean, just do you get a sense right now what anything will look like for tomorrow's game.
Well, that's a great mention because I did dive into it for yesterday's episode, in just looking at if the penalty kill is indeed an issue for the Wild, or if it's just a situation where they're being used way too much early on in the season. And I tended to lean towards, the Wild are just taking too many penalties early on in the season. I'm not going to lie, it has been a point of contention for me that the Wild have seemed to start games off slowly, at least so far this season. And so, you look at some of the penalties they're taking, it's a situation of a player getting beat down the ice and, trying to overcompensate, where if somebody runs by you, you're thinking, uh-oh, I got to do something to try to slow this guy down. So the natural reaction is to hook. And my favorite line in Blues Traveler, the hook brings you back. And by brings you back, straight to the penalty box. So the penalty kill I thought was fine. They did give up a power play goal to Vancouver, but it came at within the last 5 seconds of that penalty kill, and they killed off the other two penalties just fine. So I get the sense that it's just a little bit of too many penalties early on, and that this penalty kill unit will be just fine. But that is something that we can't necessarily take for granted coming into this game, depending on who is missing. And I have become a huge proponent of the guys on the third and fourth lines. The fourth line, especially for this Wild team, has been just sensational so far this year. Nico Sturm, Nick Bugstad, Brandon Duhaime, all guys that come in and they just win. It's as simple as that. They come in, they win faceoffs, they battle hard for the puck, they do everything that a coach wants them to do. And so, yes, you would not like to lose one of your top 6 guys, but I would argue for the Wild, it's going to be equally as big of a loss if they lose one of those guys on the fourth line due to the COVID-19 protocols. That's going to be as big of a void to fill for this Wild team as it would if they lost somebody from those top 2 lines as well.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where we want to make sure everyone is doing as much as they can to stay healthy and maintain as good a health as you can. We hope maybe it's just, mild symptoms, if any at all. But there are some, we're hockey podcasts. So we do have to talk about the hockey implications. And there will be some, again, as we saw with the Seattle Kraken, that on top of injuries that are quite natural, there certainly will be some things, and we'll see. I certainly will be taking a look-see at what the Minnesota Wild do regarding the PK, because I think that the Seattle Kraken, I think they also, that's why I really enjoyed listening to you break down, why you feel the Minnesota Wild are taking too many penalties, because I mean, I could just point to the Devils game alone, and that one, I actually was there in New Jersey, and it was like, you get a penalty and you get a penalty. And but it was at the back end of our road trip, first ever road trip. We were tired, short players, some players just coming back from all types of other injuries. So I feel that pain point, as I mentioned, with just not really knowing if this is a team that is getting themselves into what we would consider good trouble, or are they taking bad penalties? And so your problem might be, it sounds like, a little bit of fatigue, or just kind of making those mental errors and then trying to overcorrect. Whereas it was definitely fatigue and just frustration for the Seattle Kraken. But I think they've settled in, which is good to see. But Seth, okay, let's get a little bit more though of your analysis, because that being said, we both have said, our team's a little bit concerned that they're taking the wrong type of penalties. But I mean, things have still kind of worked out for the Wild, where Seattle, we just got our second win yesterday. So tell us a little bit more about this Minnesota team and how it's coming together.
Well, this Wild team has definitely been the comeback kids so far this season. They, up until the loss to Nashville, they had come back from at least a 1-goal deficit in every game so far this season. And so, much to my displeasure as host of Locked On Wild, seeing this team fall behind 1-0 in the first period on almost a nightly basis, It did seem like the Wild finally got to the point against Nashville where it was too much of a deficit for them to be able to overcome. And so they finally put it together against Vancouver. They had a lead. They played great, which was awesome to see that they bounced back. But the thing that I think has separated this Wild team from previous iterations of this franchise is that this is a team that can score in bunches and can score quickly. They have, I believe it's 4 different instances this year in which they have scored game tying goals within 60 seconds of giving up the go ahead goal so far this year. And so, that happened especially in the first couple of games of the season. They fall behind 1-0, immediately score to tie it up at 1-1. Then they give up the second goal to make it 2-1, immediately come back to tie it. And so, whereas this franchise was always kind of a grit and grind, like win you a 2-1 game, play great defense, and get good goaltending, now the offense is starting to really take over to where they can do what they did to the Winnipeg Jets and win 6-5 with 2 goals in the third period to send it to OT. And my personal preference, I like that much better. But it's fun to have that guy in Kirill Kaprizov that is a game breaker for this team. And we haven't had that since Marian Gaborik. We had a collection of good players in the Zach Parise, Ryan Suter era, but we never had anybody that could take over a game and could win it on their own. Kirill Kaprizov can do that. Kevin Fiala has shown signs of being able to do that as well. So we've seen the shift from a defense-oriented team to now a team that can definitely score in bunches with great players on defense as well, and I am fully here for it.
Hey, that sounds fantastic. As you were speaking, I was like, some of this sounds a little bit like the Seattle Kraken. The only difference is that there's no history to go off of, at least not a collective history, right? So we're still trying to figure out, what are the tendencies for the players on this team throughout their career, but what will that look like for the Seattle Kraken? So coming up, I definitely want to get a little bit more into what I've seen from Seattle and how some of what you said, I think, is playing out for us as well. And then we'll, of course, get into the head-to-head, what we're thinking there. And then we'll wrap up, though, Seth, with we got some questions, and I think they're pretty good as far as being able to pick apart the two teams and what we can expect tomorrow night, Thursday night, at the brand spanking new Climate Pledge Arena. But Seth, we got to keep the lights on here. So, and I talk over at Locked on Kraken. I'm sure you do on the Wild Show as well about the Bet Online odds. We had a question where I might allude to this again, but let's talk about Bet Online. We've got football and basketball and of course, hockey season. So what can the good folks get when they go over to betonline.ag?
The best part, Erica, is that they have revamped the entire site. And I actually had the chance to look at this in person when going through just the odds for the Central Division a couple of weeks ago before the season started. It's a whole new interface, and they have completely reworked and retooled it. So if you go to betonline.ag, and you want to throw a little money down on any given game of any given night, or you want to look a little further ahead and maybe look at some futures, they offer all of that, and it is so easy to find. It is so easy to go to exactly what you're looking for. They've got Stanley Cup odds that are updated, and so it's just a super user-friendly experience that you can definitely benefit from. They have everything from basketball. They've got football, the World Series going on right now. So baseball fans, if you're looking to get in on the action as well, they've got, of course, the NHL. They've got boxing, UFC. They even have Vegas slot games. So if you are a fan of the Vegas casino roll, they got you covered there too. So it's a full out experience at betonline.ag. And there are so many amazing offers they have available for you. So all you have to do to take advantage of all that is go to betonline.ag. And it could not be easier for you to enjoy and to throw down on those teams that you love. BetOnline says it themselves. They're the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. BetOnline.ag, where the game starts.
Where the game starts, indeed. And for us, Seth, the game will start tomorrow at Climate Pledge Arena. I know between the two of us right now and then where our respective teams are, we run the gamut as far as time zones.
Right.
But regardless of where we are independently, we know that the teams are in Seattle getting ready to play at Climate Pledge Arena. We've seen that it's been electric, and the Minnesota Wild are rolling through, swimming through, if you will, to the deep early in the season, which, as I was thinking and looking at these crowds, and, I know that things have been sold out and the 32,000 deposits and all of that stuff. But I mean, you know how sports can be. How long do you get to say you're the new kid on the block? How long do you get to ride the firsts? And I've been starting to talk about that a little bit on Locked on Kraken, to the point where I was like, you know what, Seth, it's time for us to get over, release the Kraken. The Kraken's been released. All right, we were released. We played our first game ever. We were released. We played our first home game. We got a one win on the road, and we've got one win at home. So we're running out of firsts here, and now it's time to Kraken. It's time to unleash what this team is going to become. And early on, as you were saying, like, this was a team that just kind of liked to score goals after the other team had already put one or two or three, usually two or three, on the board already. And so it's those come from behind, or, that 2-1, and then getting an equalizer and that back and forth. But I mean, if you look at the Kraken schedule, you see a lot of, 4-3, 4-2 losses for this team. So having a complete game, being able to close out a game has been difficult. And then Montreal rolled into town. And you had Brandon Tanev, who last season in total scored 7 goals. He's already got 5 for the Seattle Kraken.
Wow.
Another player, and I'm going to skip to this because also, like, low-key throwing shade to our Locked on NHL group chat. But I remember saying, Donato, kind of like this guy, friend of the pod. He popped in there. And, I was like, oh, well, he can start off good. And then he kind of fizzles out. I was like, well, as the pop group Dream once sang, he loves me. He loves you not. That's all I got to say. I think he's gonna be the real deal. I think he's gonna make it last in Seattle, or at least that's what I'm telling myself. Seth, what do you think about that?
Well, I always have said and felt that the Ryan Donato situation in Minnesota was simply just not a good fit. That he was traded to the Wilds under Paul Fenton, who was widely regarded as more of a talent acquisition guy as opposed to the full package GM. And so, Fenton did make some really good moves when he was GM of the Wild, albeit only in the 1 year that it happened. And Donato was brought in just to try to see if they could get, a spark out of a young player who had some promise offensively, and it just didn't work out here. And I'm happy to see that he has had success so far in his Seattle tenure. I'm happy that he will be forever part of Seattle Kraken lore, and I'm also happy to see that my guy Carson Soucy will also forever be part of Kraken lore. Love that guy. I think in the last 2 weeks, I've said probably 6 times just how much of an unheralded leader of this team he was, and how important what he does was to this Wild team. And it just flew totally under the radar. So I am fully here for both of those guys finding some success and having a good time in Seattle so far. I love it.
I love that you brought up Soucy as well. And again, we put out a call to some listener questions, and that was one of the ones that rolled through. So what I will say about Ryan Donato is that I think it's still very much feeling, we're feeling things out with Ryan. We saw even for the opener, he was, as far as I know, a healthy scratch, because then he comes into the game against Montreal, gets the 5th of our 5 goals. As you mentioned, part of lore there, scored the first ever Seattle Kraken goal. So not doing so bad. But I think still with Seattle, There's some development there. That was the contract, and he was brought in, I think, kind of understanding that. But I
Yep.
love that you mentioned fit, because that's extremely important on any team. And when you're an expansion team, if your GM is doing right by what they want, then they're looking for guys that they can make fit into what they have going. And so I know, like, the Seattle Kraken and Ron Francis have gotten a lot of slack for who they did and didn't take, and what has stuck and what's not working. But it's all a matter of fit. And I've talked about a full 60, but I've talked about unleashing the Kraken. I think, not just because it was a win, but it was all of the right things getting done. All of the things that we had heard Dave Haxtell, who's another person for a lot of people that's getting a second go round.
Yep.
This is a team full of folks that are getting a second go round. I know the Golden Knights probably have trademarked the team of misfits or whatever. So I'm not, we're not gonna take that from you, Vegas. But that's kind of what an expansion team is. As far as Susie, I have not had the honor and pleasure of speaking to him one-on-one yet, but everything that you said is exactly what I'm seeing on the ice. And when you play in that position, unless you're, lighting up the lamp, the less people talk about you, the better.
Yeah.
And I think that goes so underrated in hockey.
Yeah, that's spot on. And it's not a glamorous position, being, as he was with the Wild, a third line defenseman. But those two, him and Ian Cole, both were such a solidifying force for the Wilds on that third line defense. They blocked shots. They were just always in the right position. Yeah, they didn't do a lot in terms of goals and assists, but honestly, like, as I mentioned, I've pointed it out probably 5 or 6 times already that, you know, those guys did a lot of stuff that we didn't really get a chance to, talk about, just because they don't show up. They don't show up on ESPN in the box score. But it's a vital role. And so Susie is going to flourish at that. And, the other point too about Ryan Donato, it comes down to a team giving you a chance. And Wild fans saw a good parable of this with Rem Pitlick, who was claimed by the Wilds before the season started to become a member of this team. Would have had to have been put on waivers to be sent down. So he is with the Wild. He got his opportunity against Vancouver, and he played 9 minutes, but he gave this team a spark. And so, you got me sitting here campaigning and saying he got his chance. And I honestly think he deserves more of an opportunity going forward. And that could be exactly what Donato gets with Seattle. It just wasn't something he necessarily got with Minnesota. And a lot of times guys get that one opportunity and they just run with it. And that's what basically the whole fourth line has done for this Wild team. That's what Rem Pitlick did. So it's so fun to see, because it's so easy to root for those guys too, that they get that chance and they make the most of it. It just makes for an awesome story.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned Pitlick. I loved hearing that over on Locked on Wild, because after, of course, I listened to Locked on Kraken. Seth, you're one of my number 2 listens. Especially knew I was gonna have to listen to the best Minnesota Wild podcast we have out there going into this game. Although, because I've worked with Alexis, I got to give some love to the Buttes too. I got to give some
Yes.
love to the Bar Buttes, but I know you have love for them too, so it's all good.
It's funny. We are part of such a amazing group, and I'm sure you are starting to see this as well with the Kraken podcasts that have come about. It's such an amazing family. Like, I didn't know anything about hockey really before I started doing this within the last couple of years. And Alexis, Jesse, and everybody else that encompasses Minnesota podcasts, the podcast group, is just awesome. Like, we love collaborating with each other. We love making sure that that everybody's content is getting the love it deserves. It's such an awesome group, and those two are just the absolute best. And so, I say that with love, but I know they're coming for me with their next
Oh, all right. So not only do we have to listen to Locked on Kraken, not only do we have to listen to Locked on Wild, but we are going to toss some love over to the Bar Down Beauties. And,
Of
I
course.
mentioned that Alexis is family, and that's because we both have been on the call for what is now the Premier Hockey Federation, and she and I will reprise our roles. But this year, Seth, on ESPN Plus. So excited to get back into it. But speaking of family, if you're listening to Locked on Kraken, you know where I'm going with this. We're talking about my favorite family-owned business, and that's of course RockAuto.com. Been serving auto parts customers online for 20 years online though, so don't worry about going to your brick and mortar store. You get there, you know what you need, and then you don't find it in the aisles, you don't find it in the catalog. You can go right to rockauto.com. Use your mobile device, just like I'm doing today for this stream, or you can use your laptop, as long as you don't spill tea on it, like I did right before this stream. And you can find everything that you need: brake parts, tail lamp, motor oil, everything right there. So when you head over to rockauto.com, make sure you type in "How did you hear?" in there, "How did you hear about us?" box, Locked On, so that they know that we sent you. We talked about family. RockAuto.com is a part of our family as being one of our sponsors, Seth. So, of course, we're going to toss over some stick taps there. But another part of our family, of course, are our fabulous listeners that take the time when they're headed to work, when they're coming home from work, or even headed to the game to listen to our shows. So we thank you so much. And because you're such fantastic loyal listeners, we all had a little bit of time to get to some of the questions that were submitted to us, Seth. So we alluded to it. We got to some of the players already, Seth, but there was another question. There were a few questions that I'm gonna let you dive into a little bit, because folks want to know, like, how's the Seattle Kraken team gonna do? And I keep it pretty, I keep it pretty straight. Maybe that's the New Yorker in me, like. I'm gonna keep it straight and to the point, but let's get your assessment, Seth. What are you thinking about this Seattle Kraken team?
It's funny because
And we got a question.
it's funny in looking at this Kraken roster. Yanni Gord is obviously one of the names that jumps off the page to me, as one of just that huge, immensely talented, the game breaker line for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And so coming over to the Kraken in the expansion draft, he obviously getting a chance to start his season after starting the year injured. Looks to be from what I've been able to gather, just an absolute um, just electricity on the ice, and so huge point for me to watch, just to try to see what he's going to do next. Of course, familiar with Philip Grubauer as well from his days with the Colorado Avalanche. Um, so there are plenty of familiar names, and I have come up with the former Wild player curse, in that it seems as though former Wild players have a tendency to just go nuts on their former team. And so, of course, we got to keep an eye on Carson Soucy and Ryan Donato as well. But it's so funny because people look for the initial like roster reaction to an expansion team, and it is such a long term project. Like, yes, you are selecting players um off of rosters, but you may not necessarily be going for the guy that is the best fit or the best overall player, based off of what people put down, in their expansion mock drafts. I know that was a thing for some reason. So people have their wish list, their Christmas wish list for what the roster should look like, but they're not taking into account the head coach, the GM, the scouts, who are inevitably saying, hey, long term, we feel like this guy has some really good upside that we can cash in on now, and put them in as part of this franchise. So, you know, I know there was a lot of reaction as soon as the roster was put together of people being like, well, why didn't they take so and so? It's like, well, we got to think long term here, my friends. This is not just a 1 year project. Like, this is a this is a franchise build. And that
Yes.
does not go by the traditional rules that everybody likes to think it does.
Seth, you get me. You get me.
I got you.
I appreciate that. And now we were meant to talk at this point in the season because I'm also like I'm super eye test, and I was like, what do you want me to say? I gotta see it. I gotta see it. I can tell you what these guys did last year or 2 years ago for the ones that were in the league, but you want me to ask how they're going to perform on the Kraken? I can't tell you that. I can't do it.
Right?
Nobody can. Not realistically. You got to see everything put together. Again, Tanev almost has as many goals as he did last season. So there you go. But all right. So Sergeant Pickles, we had a few questions. Some of the questions about players were from that fan, but also we got to talk about some wild players. And I don't know, some guy I heard he maybe signed. But it was pretty much like just done deal right away, right? No drama whatsoever in the off season.
Pen to paper immediately. There was no sort of long, drawn out process that made me lose a lot of my my hair here. No.
Yeah.
Kirill Kaprizov signed as soon as the contract was presented. It was great. It was fine.
It was fine. It was totally fine. It was totally fine. I loved your rants on that over the offseason. It was fantastic. Which again was totally normal window, didn't overlap with anything, totally fine.
Yeah, if you want, just look at a sample audio wave. If you want my range of reactions, like up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Like it's crazy. It was crazy.
Yeah, it was wild. It was wild. But terrible jokes aside, Kirill Kaprizov is definitely a player that I'm sure every team, now 32 of them, 31, because I guess you don't really scout your own guys, or you might, but not against how lethal they will be in the negative side. But so Kaprizov is definitely someone that a lot of people are. What do we have to know? If you could be, just a little impartial, just for a moment, for a slither of time, and you had to scout for the Seattle Kraken, what would you say about Kaprizov? And are there other players that we should be looking out for?
Great question. So if I'm looking at this with the neutral eye, the neutral observer, the best instance that I can, or the best thing that I can use to describe Kirill Kaprizov is those little remote control cars with the that you wind up and then you just put on the ground and they just go. That is Kirill Kaprizov at his best. He does not stop moving, and I have had a handful of times in the last year plus where he will just take the puck and will skate laps around the perimeter of the zone. And you've got the defenders and the other players on the other team that are just watching him do it. And they're like, what do we do? Like, what are we supposed to do with this? But he's always looking to make a play. He has this tendency to try to set his teammates up with these otherworldly passes. He's able to anticipate where his teammates are going to be before they are sometimes. And that's both good and bad because his teammates sometimes are not ready for those. But the thing that we're seeing with Kaprizov this year is that opponents are diverting a lot more attention to him. We saw there were a handful of times against Vancouver where there were two Canucks that were on either side of him at all times. And so you are gambling majorly as an opponent when you're devoting that much attention to a guy. But Calder Trophy winner, you got to do something. And he has, I think, started to get a little frustrated as the season has gone on. No goals yet, 5 assists through 6 games. And so it has been imperative that other guys step up. And that's where that fourth line has really been so key, is that the Nico Sturm, Nick Bjugstad, and Brandon Duhaime line has been so good so far this year that Dean Evison has started to go to them in critical situations to give them time because they don't stop motoring ever. We saw in, I think it was in the game against Winnipeg, in which the Wild had an opportunity at the end of the game to win it before it went into overtime. They were on, or no, it wasn't Winnipeg, because they scored like right as the game was going to OT to send it to OT. But it was the game before that. They had the fourth line on the ice for the final minute of regulation, trying to give those guys an opportunity to win the game. And so Kirill Kaprizov's production has slowed a little bit to start the year. Those fourth line guys are just continuing to trend in a great direction. I will be a fourth line stan for the rest of my life, based off of how they've played. And the other thing, kind of the ace in the sleeve, is Kevin Fiala, who has not really gotten going yet himself, but he is another guy that can put 2 or 3 game stretches together where he maybe gets you 3-4 goals. And so it's like a dormant volcano.
Ooh.
That the Wild are winning right now without production from Kaprizov or Fiala. If those guys get going, though, look out.
As you were talking about Kaprizov and, just breaking his game down, I immediately thought of Tanev. We've talked about him already a few times. But then with a mix, you talked about the passing, which I love. I love a good hockey pass.
Oh, yeah.
So that reminded me of any combination of a line that I really loved coming out of preseason, which I dubbed the Triple J line, Jared McCann, Jordan Eberle, Jaden Schwartz. So that was a line for a little bit here for the Seattle. I think McCann centering those two was really interesting, not his natural position. It's something that he had to adjust to. But the passing, they would get very creative with the passing on that line. Didn't always connect. And then we got some players back, either from COVID protocol or obviously Yanni Gourde coming back, Wenberg coming back after his fiance having their child. So, a lot of things happened where that line got split. But similarly to also what you said, I think, well, again, with the exception of we don't have as many wins, but, we're getting there. We're going to get there. But I think if we can see Schwartz and Eberle get started, that's going to be really good for the Seattle Kraken team.
I want to flip one back on you because, with being a new franchise to the league, obviously having the home opener, and from what I could see, and I'm sure you can speak more to it being there, electricity, like just electricity everywhere, the arena just absolutely rocking. And so that is a weapon as well that a home team can employ, is just this unbelievable level of noise that really does rattle a team coming in on the road, especially a shorthanded team like the Wild. And so, another element that I look for as being a huge part of this game is the crowd.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be massive. And I can say I've been in a Seattle Kraken crowd. I have not been, though, at Climate Pledge Arena yet. Some folks know I'm making a move. So I was like, better not risk it. And then, gets stuck in Seattle. Who would want that? I mean, maybe me at this point. But yeah, so I'm not there and I haven't been at Climate Pledge. But that being said, I've been able to catch up with folks that are there. And I talked about this on the podcast before. I knew what the goal song was going to be because we heard it in preseason. It's a really nice mix, Nirvana, and so it's Lithium from Nirvana. And yeah, I like it. I'm not gonna crack. Oh, it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
It's so good. So when I was watching the first home game, I was watching, and I even rewatched it in anticipation of being able to hear that goal song for the first time in a regular season game. Couldn't hear it because the crowd was so loud. I couldn't hear the goal song. You couldn't hear anything. That's how loud it was in Climate Pledge Arena. And I know from going to rock concerts and other things like that, when you have that much energy, it's not just that everyone's loud and excited, but you can actually make a place rock. You can make it bounce. And if Seattle gets on the board early, Forget about it. Forget about it. That's what we saw in that game against Montreal. And now Seattle has been able to adjust to that. They're quite literally adjusting to Climate Pledge Arena. They don't have very many more games in hand than Minnesota rolling into Climate Pledge
Right.
Arena. So all of that is definitely going to play a factor, but I had to be a little more neutral myself. The advantage of catching the Kraken as they are on the front end of playing at CPA, or yes, CPA. I was like, what are the acronyms? The upside is that we're still very much figuring things out. And so if I were talking to Wild fans right now, I'd want to see the Minnesota Wild do what we talked about earlier, that they don't always do, and is to strike early. So that being said, we have two teams that we know can come from behind, but someone's got to score first, Seth. So
Right.
do you have any predictions? What are you expecting on that front?
I think I'm going to be so bold as to say I think the Kraken do get on the board first, because I think the Wild are just going to be trying to, and again, we don't know who is going to be missing per se, but I think the Wild will be trying to adjust to that. And so I look for this to be, I'm going to say 3-2. And I think the Kraken will get on the board first, and it'll be up to the Wild to try to adjust. Ultimately, I think the Kraken will win 3-2 here in this one. And, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because this has propensity, I think, for a game where if the Wild, especially if they get down 2-0, that we could see a repeat of the Nashville game. But I get the sense that this team has turned it around and has put that game out of their memory. So I think this is going to be a great game between these two teams, and I think it'll be a 1-goal game, probably 3-2 is my guess.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. Although, just for a little spice, to make it spicy, as Alexis might say, I'm gonna go 4-2. Just because the Seattle Kraken, whether we're on the winning end or the losing end, we seem to like the number 4.
Okay.
So I'm going with that. But again, I really would love to see Eberle continue. We saw him get his first goal. I'd love to see Jaden Schwartz tear it up. So we'll see what happens there. But Seth, through all of our own tech issues here, through the news of the Minnesota Wild unfortunately having some of their staff and players go through COVID protocol, which again, we want to make sure that we're sending our best wishes for the overall health and safety of everyone. I think this is going to be a really good test for both teams when it's all said and done.
Yeah, this is going to be a fantastic game. I can't wait to watch it play out. It's so good. Like, it's so good to have, hockey on ESPN and TNT again, to where you can watch. Like, this is an Xbox household, and so I got the Quadcast on my TV, and so I've got one TV for the Wild, and then I have another TV for whatever is left. It's pure bliss. Like, I look at it any night that there's hockey on, and I'm like, is this real? Like, how is this possible? So it's going to be just an absolute blast.
Absolutely. Well, this was an absolute blast.